the Conqueror and the harrowing of the North, for which we Northerners have never forgiven him, that William, in 1069. And really, to explain what's happening in 1069 and the harrowing of the North, or the harrying of the North, we've really got to go back to William the Conqueror, a couple of years earlier, 1066. And here he is, looking really fine, with his nice armour on, mail chaussel, mail stockings covering his legs, with boiled leather kneecaps, and he's got boiled leather elbow pads as well, if only you could see them. And he's wearing, in this depiction, he's got barding on his horse, cloth, sometimes called a caparisons, showing again the 3 lions of England, and a little shield as well, because as armour covers the body, the shields get smaller. And you'll be thinking there, this doesn't look like a Norman knight from 1066. And you are quite right. This is a 13th century depiction of William the Conqueror, looking very, very fine indeed. The 3 lions of England we'll come back to later on, when we've looked at the harrowing of the North, and York's part in defending itself against that William from Normandy. And the 3 lions of England, obviously part of the coat of arms of England, were first adopted by Richard I, so a long time after William the Conqueror. So William then conquers the country in 1066. But he's not the only contender for the throne in 1066. On the 5th of January, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, well, second to last, Edward the Confessor, dies. He has no children and he has no known heir at that time. And this is a depiction from the Battle Tapestry showing Edward the Confessor's funeral cortege. He did, on his deathbed, say that he wished his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson, to be his heir, in a deathbed confession just before he died. But there were, of course, others, including William, who thought they should be King of England. Harold Godwinson is crowned in London, and again we have a lovely depiction from the Bayeux Tapestry here of his crowning. But a few years earlier, in the 1050s, there is a story that Harold Godwinson had gone over, whether he'd been shipwrecked or had gone over to the continent with intent, we do not know. But what we do know is that he was at the court of William, Duke of Normandy. And whilst he was at the court of William, Duke of Normandy, he went on a hunting expedition with William. He also went on forays into foreign territory and participated in battles with William. And this depiction from the Bayeux Tapestry, actually shows William of Normandy giving Harold Godwinson armour, a helmet, and a sword. Now, these are quite significant acts because it would seem that Harold Godwinson had made some kind of promise to William of Normandy to be his vassal, if you like, to be his man, and certainly to pay homage to William. And there is a story, certainly in Norman accounts, that Harold Godwinson had promised, and in fact had done more than promise, had sworn an oath on holy relics that he would help William of Normandy gain the throne of England when Edward the Confessor died. William of Normandy was a cousin, first or second removed, of Edward the Confessor. He shared a bloodline with Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor was the grandson of Ethelred Unred, who had been pushed off the throne by Canute in the early 1000s, and Edward, as a young lad, had fled overseas to Normandy, to the ducal court there, and spent quite a while in Normandy. William and Edward knew each other, and William, it would seem, had asked Harold to make a promise to support him in the event that Edward the Confessor died, to gain the throne of England. And when you look at the Bayeux Tapestry, this story of Harold making the oath to William, and then towards the end of the Bayeux Tapestry, Harold being struck through the eye by perhaps the wrath of God with the arrow through the eye, which was, of course, the pathway to the soul, depicts really this whole oath-taking is central, absolutely central, to the story of the Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts Harold as an oath-breaker, therefore deserving his end with the arrow through the eye, if that actually happened. This is quite important because when Harold takes the throne, and he is elected king, as it were, the Witan, which is a group of high-ranking nobles, could choose the next king in Anglo-Saxon England from the family of the kings, the royal family. The natural heir to Edward the Confessor would have been his 14-year-old nephew, Edgar Atheling, the young prince. But Edgar Atheling, being only 14, it was thought could not command and lead armies. Therefore, the Witan approved of Edward the Confessor's deathbed wish, and Harold was crowned King of England, thus betraying his holy oath on the bones of saints. So it is said. The north of England wasn't really very supportive of the Godwine family. Harold's father, Godwine, had been a very high-ranking thane or noble in Edward the Confessor's reign. And he had huge amounts of land, certainly in the south of England. His sons, not only Harold, who gained land on the Sussex coast, but also Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine and even Tostig, had been given huge earldoms in Anglo-Saxon England just prior to Edward the Confessor's death. And this, in the north of England, we were very independent. We had our own earls. In fact, as you well know, for many years, York, indeed, had been the capital of Jorvik, the Viking kingdom. And it had only been 100 years since Athelstan had conquered the north from the kingdom of Wessex. And the kingdom of Wessex, for those of you who don't know, is down here in the south. That's where Alfred the Great came from. And the 9th and 10th centuries is really about the House of Wessex reconquering territory from the Danish kingdoms and Norwegian kingdoms, as you can see, certainly in the north of England here. And York had only fallen, in the 950s to the House of Wessex? 100 years ago in 1066. Memories ran deep. The North still remembered its independence. And so in 1065, when Seward, the Earl of Northumbria, in 1065, when
the brother of Harold, Tostig, was given the earldom of Northumbria. The north revolted. Earls Edwin and Morcar certainly revolted. They had their eye on the earldom of Northumbria. They were related to the old earls of Northumbria. And Tostig, brother of Harold Godwinson, was actually kicked out of Northumbria during that rebellion. He fled north to the Scots. A huge sense of independence in the north of England, and certainly not really allied to the Godwins. There is Harold again, made king, crowned king, and he knew that his throne was a little risky. He knew that he would have to contend with perhaps an invasion from Normandy, but more than that, perhaps also an invasion from Norway, from Denmark, because, of course, England had been ruled by Canute, Viking king, if you like, and Harald Hardrada, from the King of Norway, did feel he had a right to be King of England as well. And certainly, in 1066, we have not one battle, the Battle of Hastings. We have three battles. The first is the Battle of Fulford, then the Battle of Stamford, and then the Battle of Hastings. Tostig, Harold Godwinson's brother, allied with Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, and in September 1066, they sailed up the Humber, up the Ouse, which was navigable from the Humber in those days, and there was a ferocious battle between Tostig and Harald Hardrada and Earls Edwin and Morcar, who were defending York. Earls Edwin and Morcar, on the 20th of September 1066, failed to stop Tostig and Harald Hardrada. They were defeated. And Tostig and Harald Hardrada came into York, retook the city for the Vikings, as it were, and then demanded hostages, demanded booty to be taken to their boats. 240 to 300 boats, depending which numbers you trust, had sailed up the Humber and the Ouse to attack York. At Stamford Bridge, Harald Hardrada and Tostig waited for the booty to be brought to them to put in their ships. And they were surprised on the 25th of September, 5 days after the Battle of Fulford. At Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson had marched troops from the south of England 300 kilometres in 5 days. Hard marching his men, 40, 50 miles a day. And Harold won against Harald Hardrada and his brother Tostig, and defeated them. And this is a depiction of Stamford Bridge. But as you can see, the arms and armour there is not very like the 11th century arms and armour that they should be depicted wearing. It's, again, a 13th century depiction. But you get an idea of the bloody battle that Stamford Bridge was. And it is said, out of the 240 to 300 ships that Harald Hardrada and Tostig had sailed to attack York up the Humber and the Ouse, that only 20-odd escaped. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, himself was killed, as was Tostig. So ended one Norwegian attack on York. During this time, whilst Harold Godwinson had been taken north to defend York against these Norwegian attackers and his own brother Tostig, William of Normandy had been getting ready to invade England. During the summer, Harold Godwinson had placed the Third, or the Anglo-Saxon soldiers, on the Isle of Wight to defend against an invasion from William. They thought that was the most likely place that he would be coming to. But William had been preparing. In all, it is thought he brought maybe roughly about 1,000 men with him, not all Normans. He had the Pope's blessing to invade England because Harold Godwinson was an oath breaker. And he certainly, when he arrived in England and fought at Hastings, one of the standards that he flew was the papal cross. William got ready. Not only were there Normans, there were Bretons, men flocked from all over France. It was a great adventure. They were going to carve out fortunes as young men joining William of Normandy. And in this classic depiction from the Bayeux Tapestry, you can see the sorts of things that William is packing into his ships. The mail shirts there you've got a piece of wood going through the arms of the mail shirts there. And what looks like nifty cycling shorts are actually a split in the skirt of the mail shirt, because these mail shirts are for Norman knights riding on horseback. And if you think about it, sitting on rings of metal for a long period of time would not be comfortable. So you would actually lift your skirts of mail, sit your bottom on your horse, and let the mail cover your upper thigh. You also see you've got the classic Norman helmets there with the nasal at the front to cover your nose, and all sorts of other things. Perhaps in this barrel here are arrowheads, wrapped in grease and stacked tightly together in a wooden barrel to bring over to England for the invasion. And then the night before the battle, the arrowheads would be put on the shafts of wood, which would be, a cloth yard long, something like that, 24 to 36 inches, roughly. Don't know what that is in centimetres. I'm not metric. But perhaps that is in there. All sorts of things. Wood had to be felled to build the boats, to bring the troops to England. And of course, they had to be a certain kind of boat to allow horses to get out on the beach and get on the boat in Normandy and then onto the beach. William first lands in Pevensey in Sussex, today East Sussex. It was a deliberate move. Sussex was actually the heart of Harold Godwinson's estates. And by landing in Pevensey and threatening Harold's tenants in Pevensey, he was actually making certain that Harold would come to him and fight William on William's terms. William landed at Pevensey on the 28th of September 1066, 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And Harold Godwinson only hears that William has landed as he is on his way south. It is said that the casualties, although Harold Godwinson had won, the casualties on the English side at Stamford Bridge were still pretty high. Earls Edwin and Morcar, having been defeated by the Vikings at Fulford, were licking their wounds. They felt they'd been humiliated. So when they heard that they were being asked to march south to defend the Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, they took their time, and they actually arrived too late to fight at Hastings. William the Conqueror, very, very clever. If you think he's entered enemy territory, he doesn't want to advance too far inland because he might get cut off from his retreat line back to his boats and his supply lines. He cleverly goes from Pevensey, where he erects a castle, to Hastings, and he builds yet another castle, and he waits at Hastings for Harold to come to him. Harold, having heard William has landed in Sussex, the land of his tenants, hot-foots it down to London, amasses what army he can. He can't wait for the archers to join him, the foot soldiers, and he goes to meet William at the battle that we know as Hastings. There is great debate about where exactly Hastings was fought and on which hill. I'm not going to go into that because we're thinking about the harrying of the north. But the English, as you may know, were lined up on the top of the hill in classic style in the Saxon shield wall. They could ride horses in battle, and there is evidence, certainly, that in some of the northern battles they fought on horseback, but at Hastings they fought on foot. And in the Bayeux Tapestry, this is the Saxon shield wall at the top of the hill at Hastings. And it looks as if they're wearing Norman armour. They've got kite-shaped shields, they've got mail shirts, again looking like cycling shorts. But this is the fashionable armour of the 11th century. And if you were rich, this is what you would be able to afford. The lower legs would be defended with cloth wrapped round the leg, and the kite-shaped shield would be held to defend the lower legs as well when knights were charging in battle. How can we tell that this is a Saxon shield wall? Well, in the Bayeux Tapestry, there's a very handy bit of Latin above it that tells us it's a Saxon shield wall. And also, this fella's got a beard, look at that. And I think, I can't see any other moustaches, but the Saxons like to have beards and long curly moustaches, apparently. And the Normans were clean-shaven and even shaved the backs of their heads halfway up their head like that. So, if the Saxons, if Harold Godwinson's army had kept its nerve, perhaps we would not now be talking of William the Conqueror. But they were fooled by the feint of the Norman cavalry who pretended to flee down the hill from the Saxons. The Saxons broke ranks, chased them down the hill, thinking that they had victory, and then the Normans on horseback surrounded the group that had broken away and cut it down. They did this perhaps the first time by mistake, but certainly they repeated that manoeuvre. The Battle of Hastings was a long-fought, bloody battle. It lasted over 10 hours, and at the end, most Anglo-Saxon nobility, and certainly Harold, had been killed. And here is the death of Harold. But which fella is Harold? Is it this fella with, that looks like an arrow going into the eye? Or is it, and most contemporary written accounts talk about Harold Godwinson being surrounded and hacked to death? Is this man here, there we go, is that man Harold? It's not clear from this rolling cartoon, if you like, from the Bayeux Tapestry. What is certain is Harold died. Earls Edwin and Morcar didn't quite make it to the Battle of Hastings. They retreated to London, and they suggested that perhaps Edward the Confessor's 14-year-old nephew, Edgar Atheling, should be elected king by the Witan, which is what the remaining Anglo-Saxon nobles did, elected Edgar Atheling king. But William, having succeeded in killing the King of England, then consolidated his initial victory in battle. He marched from Hastings to Dover to secure the ports in case he needed to get back to Normandy, securing his retreat, as it were. He took Canterbury, the religious centre of England, and then he marched on London. He was repulsed at London Bridge at Suffolk, and so he decided to go round London, forded the river at Newbury, and harried the land as he went. By the time he got to Berkhamsted, London was afeard of him, and they submitted. Earls Edwin and Morcar and Edgar Atheling submitted to William the Conqueror. But, okay, this all happened in the south of England. William the Conqueror is crowned king in 1066, and then he goes back to Normandy and takes with him Earls Edwin and Morcar and other earls, Waltheof as well, with him. And whilst he's in Normandy, he leaves Bishop Odo of Bayeux, his half-brother, and William Fitz-Osbern as his regents. And that's when the trouble starts. As Odoric Vitalis tells us, but meanwhile, the English were groaning under the Norman yoke and suffering oppressions from the proud lords who ignore the king's injunctions. The petty lords who were guarding the castles oppressed all the native inhabitants of high and low degree and heaped shameful burdens upon them. For Bishop Odo and William Fitz-Osbern, the king's vice-regents, were so swollen with pride that they would not deign to hear the reasonable pleas of the English or give them impartial judgment. When their men-at-arms were guilty of plunder and rape, they protected them by force and wreaked their wrath more violently upon those who complained of the cruel wrongs they suffered. And the inevitable happened. Not all the lords, the Anglo-Saxon lords, were killed at Hastings. Edwin, Morcar, Waltheof, Gospatrick, many powerful men. And in 1067, there are rebellions all over England. The illegitimate sons of Harold Godwinson attack Somerset. There's an attack on Dover Castle. There's an attack by Edric the Wild in Shropshire, Hereford way. And in the north of England, Copsey, the right-hand man of Tostig, had been given the earldom of Northumbria by William. Well, the north hadn't liked Tostig, and we didn't like Copsey. And a relation of the old Earl of Northumbria, Oswald, rebelled, made himself Earl, and started marching south on York. In 1068, we had more uprisings in the north of England. Earl Gospatrick in the north. Earls Edwin and Morcar revolt in Mercia, joined by their nephew, the Prince of Wales. We've even got Harold Godwinson's mother, Githa, rebelling in Exeter, and Harold's sons attacking again in Devon and Cornwall. William has not conquered England. Any one of these revolts could have turned the tables against William. But in 1068, William, having returned from Normandy, makes short shrift of all these rebellions. And you can see how fast he moves. Edwin and Morcar, having made their peace with William in 1066, gone to Normandy with him. In 1068, they are rebelling with the Earls of Northumbria, Gospatrick at the time. And they defend York. But as they see William coming north, they decide to make their peace with him round about Warwick way. And once they have submitted, the north cannot continue fighting on. William, as he marches north, builds castles on his way. And as you can see, he builds one at Warwick, he builds one at Nottingham, he builds one at York. Probably the one where Clifford's Tower now is. Probably, but there were 2 castles in York. William, the first thing he does landing at Pevensey is to build a castle. And what do we mean by a castle in 1066? We mean a motte of earth which the Normans would have rounded up the local peasantry to build. And on top, a wooden structure, a Motte and Bailey castle, a wooden structure at the top there, and this is a classic image, and then an area down here with stables and blacksmiths and so on. These were based on the castles that William had had in Normandy. And if you look at this illustration from the Bayeux Tapestry, you can see how they were used. Castles are not for defence, they are for attack. Because if they were for defence, they are only wooden structures. And you can see here, these gentlemen here actually setting flame to this castle in the Bayeux Tapestry. They are for attack. And certainly William builds castles as temporary refuges for his Norman knights. He builds them about 10 miles apart, and then the area between the castles would be harried and ravaged and subdued. That is the mechanism of the conquest of England. He starts that in the late 1060s. By the late 1080s, the castles are going up towards the Hadrian's Wall. But in 1069 then, we have yet another rebellion in Northumbria. The Norman Earl, Robert Comines. He walks into Durham with 900 of his Norman soldiers. The English attack him, and he and his 900 soldiers are burnt to death in the bishop's palace, where they had taken refuge. Only 2 survived, it is said. William marches north yet again. And this time, having so much trouble with the north of England, he decides to make an example of the north. As he marches north, you can see this huge swathe that he cuts as he marches north. The summer of 1066, the Norwegians try to invade yet again. They also attack East Anglia. We've got Hereward the Wake in Lye area, holding out down here, a rebel. Earls Edwin and Morcar and Gospatrick and Waltheof all get involved in this rebellion centred on York. They almost succeed. York is taken. The Norman garrison that was in York is cut down. Waltheof apparently stood outside the gates of the Norman castle, and as the Norman cavalry tried to sortie out to attack, he cut them down with a great axe. William retaliates, and he harries the land as he marches north. He retakes York, he buys off the Viking attackers, and he celebrates Christmas in York. And then the harrying really begins. In his search for the wife of Harold Godwinson and her young baby boy, he sends Normans across from York to Chester, where he believes that they are hiding, and ravages the land as he goes. Harold's son and his mother escape to Ireland. So that explains the harrying from York to Chester there. Never did William show such cruelty in the harrying of the north. He didn't trouble to restrain his resentment, striking down innocent and guilty alike with an equal fury. In this manner, all the sources of life north of the Humber were destroyed. He burnt seed corn. He slaughtered cattle. It is said that the North starved for 3 generations. But remember, there had been a lot of rebellion in the north of England, a lot of troops moving, and perhaps some of this destruction could have been down to that. But contemporary sources tell us, in his anger at the English barons, William commanded that all crops and herds, chattels and foods should be burnt to ashes, so the north be stripped of all means of survival. So terrible a famine fell upon the people that more than 100,000 young and old starved to death. My writings have often praised William, but for this act I can only condemn him, says Odoric Vitalis. Simeon of Durham tells us there was such hunger that men ate the flesh of their own kind, of horses and dogs and cats. Others sold themselves into perpetual slavery that they might be able to sustain their miserable lives. It was horrible to look into the ruined farmyards and houses and see the human corpses dissolved into corruption, for there were none to bury them. For all were gone either in flight or cut down by the sword and famine. None dwelt there, and travellers passed in great fear of wild beasts and savage robbers. It's certainly a dreadful picture that is being painted of the north of England. And certainly some areas would have been made waste by William's troops. And William's motive, perhaps, would have been to seek out some of those rebels who did not submit to him. It is said he himself continued to comb forests and remote mountainous places, stopping at nothing to hunt out the enemy hidden there. His camps were spread out over an area of 100 miles. He cut down many in his vengeance, destroyed the lair of others, harried the land, and burned homes to ashes. The North took a long time to recover from the harrying of the North. It is said that we have a lot of monasteries, especially Cistercian monasteries in the North, because they were brought in to reclaim land that had been laid waste. And yet, when you think about it, William only had 1,000 Normans, roughly, with him in 1066 that conquered England. A few others might have come later, but it's a very small amount of Normans. Could William have harried the whole of the north? Could his soldiers have been everywhere? As the heir to Edward the Confessor, that you can see here, William had tried with the remaining Anglo-Saxon landowners to negotiate with them and keep them in power, because he knew that would help him rule if they were loyal. After the rebellion of 1069, he changed his policy, and it is from 1069 that we see Anglo-Saxon great lords losing their lands and Norman lords gaining lands. And when you look at, and apologies for my map, it's not precise, but you can see the major roads to York. And when you look at the strategy that William adopted with the great lordships, certainly the Percy, Hugo Baldric, son of Baldric, Fitzbaldric, the Archers family there, the Count of Mortain there, they are defending the major routes to York. You've got a huge barony created in Holderness to defend against invasion from the Baltic, from Norway, from Denmark. And you've got the Warenne and Lacy honours Pontefract, Wakefield area, defending the line of the road south. It is very strategic. Richmond, based on Richmond, which incorporated the lands of Edwin, many lands of Morcar as well, is strategically based, with a brand new castle built at Richmond, very near the chief manor of Earl Edwin, demonstrating that the Normans have taken control. But it's a very strategic placement of these baronies and honours, including the Percys here, on the road across the Pennines to Lancashire as well. And when you look at who lost these lands, the Anglo-Saxons lost lands so that the Norman honours could be created. Gospatrick, who had been an Earl of Northumbria, son of Arncatel, and you can see he had, 122 manors before the Norman conquest. But he lost them to two Normans, Ernest de Buron and Hugo, son of Baldric. And when you look at the Domesday entries for York itself, you can see that Ernest de Buron has 4 houses of Grim, Alwyn, Gospatrick and Gospatrick, 2 Gospatricks, and the church of St. Martin. Richard, son of Ersast, 3 houses of Alchemont and Gospatrick and Bernulph, and the church of Holy Trinity. Hugo, son of Baldric, has 4 houses of Adolphus, Hednet, Turkill and Gospatrick, and 29 small mansions at Arent, and the church of St. Andrews, which he bought. 18 Norman or French knights held a lot of property in post-conquest York. And Gospatrick, as you can see, lost his lands. Gamelbar, another Anglo-Saxon involved in the rebellion in 1069, huge estates here prior to the conquest, lost his lands to William Percy. And when you look at the Domesday entrance for William Percy, for York, he has 14 mansions of these men: Bernulphus, Gamelbar, Sort, Egbert, Selkirk, Algrim, Norman, Dunstan, Odulf, Welleret, Uccle, Godelant, Sonover, Osbert, and the Church of St. Mary. What's significant is the names of those who lose their houses are Saxon-sounding names. You have displacement of Anglo-Saxon landowners, and their land has been given to the new Normans, landowners that William can count on to keep order in the north. And his close friend and distant relative, Count Alan, was given, yes, Richmond, and you can see there's Richmond, huge amount of manors, but also given the lands of Harold Godwinson's wife, first wife in East Anglia, huge estates. And he gained the lands of Earl Edwin in Yorkshire. 166 manors in Yorkshire alone. And when you look at Domesday, you can see that in Fulford, he gets the manor of Morcar. You can also see the value has decreased from 20 shillings in 1066 to 16 shillings in 1086. In Clifton, that was waste. But it does still have a value, 20 shillings. In Overton, again, it doesn't lose its value. And in Skelton, Earl Allen has 1 vassal with 1 plough. In Stockton, it is waste, but it belongs to the canons. When you look at the Domesday Book, which was carried out in 1086, you can see quite a lot of manors that are called waste. But what does waste mean? It can mean different things. It can mean the land being given to the church or monastic foundations, therefore it is waste. Or it can mean it's not arable land, it is meadow, and therefore it is considered waste. or estates have been amalgamated. Some estates appear twice in Domesday, once as a king's manor, once, say, as a Lacy manor. They're amalgamated because of land reorganisation, and as an accounting mechanism. Those who compiled Domesday sort of wrote off one manor as waste. So you've got to be very careful when you look at Domesday to think, well, what is waste? Merlesway, the sheriff of York, held 72 manors before the conquest. Again, he lost his lands to Ralph Paynell. And even Normans, like Ernest de Buren, who we saw earlier, had taken lands and houses in York. He found he was stripped of his lands in the early 1100s, losing them to the Mowbrays and Paynells. If people rebelled, and Normans rebelled in 1075, 1088, against the Norman kings, you could lose your lands too. But it's huge redistribution of lands. And when we look at who were the tenants in chief, those who owed rent and homage to William the Conqueror for their lands in the north of England, and the value of their estates in 1066 and in 1086 from the Domesday Book, you can see that these figures show that in the main there is a drastic drop in the value of lands, which could be evidence to support a drastic harrying of the north of England in 1069. But there were also raids by Norwegians and Northmen later on in the north of England, so it could represent that, could represent change of land use. And if you look at Alan, Count of Brittany, and his great honour of Richmond, you can see it was worth, £215 in 1066, 1086, £86. Huge drop in value. But then you think of Richmond and the honour of Richmond, the monasteries that are in Richmond, the land that has been written off and counted as waste. You think of its very high upland area land as well. It's not that rich for arable purposes. And you also think that Alan, who held the honour of Richmond, he had moved the chief town of the honour to Richmond from Gilling, which had been Edwin's chief caput or chief manor. And therefore in Richmond this could simply be land that is being used for different purposes. And in Richmond, Alan certainly had problems attracting villagers to work on these particular lands. So they weren't actually making a profit in 1086. But what really strikes you when you look at this is William of Warenne, who his lands were worth £18 in 1066, and in 1066, in 1086 they're worth £40. He's doing something good, isn't he, to get that huge increase. But you can view these figures either way to prove that there was a real harrying of the north that caused economic disruption. Or you can look at them and say, well, it's touch and go what they mean. And when you look at the honours, and my little fires there show where the lands have been made waste. And you can see the big bag of money there by the Warenne estate to show that had actually improved. Now that could be down to land management of the Warennes in the 20-year period, roughly between 1069 and 1086. When you look at York itself, it is said that in 1086 only 25% of the original population lived in Yorkshire. And there is certainly depopulation in York. Some say a half, some say a third, 2/3. It's difficult to know. And when you look at the areas that have been called waste in York and the areas around York, you can see that certainly York itself, some parts of it are waste, but some parts are also making money. Heworth is the same on the same estate. And it seems that certainly in some areas of York, those estates where half had been given to canons or St. Peter's were written off as waste. And other areas, I don't know why Cotman thought it was making a profit, but there it is. So it's a tricky picture. What we can say when we look at York after 1069, York had 2 castles. Originally, William had built 1 castle, and it is not sure whether the castle that he built originally is the one under Clifford's Tower here, or the one across the River Ouse in the Old Bailey here. There was certainly a motte there. But after 1069, he built 2 castles. There's only London had 2 castles that early, and later on, I know Lewis in East Sussex also had 2 castles. But in order to protect, certainly this castle here, Clifford's Tower, the king flooded and dammed the foss to make the king's pool and fish pool. And by doing that, 400 houses and 2 mills were lost to York. It is a defence, and of course the king gets fish every Friday, which is an advantage, and he can sell it. But it did have an effect on York, and certainly this area. The 18 Frenchmen who held houses in York held land in Walmgate, and you can see that that would be, again, part of the defence of the castle. In the Domesday entry for York, we are told, in the city of York in the time of King Edward, besides the ward of the Archbishop, there were 6 wards. One of these was destroyed when the castles were built. In 5 of these wards, there were 1,418 inhabited mansions. The Archbishop has yet a 3rd part of one of these wards. In these, no one but as a burgess was entitled to any customary payments, except Maelswain, in one mansion which is below the castle. A burgess is a citizen, a burgher, a member of the burh, the fortified city of York, which means that the citizenship of York goes back a long way, certainly before 1066. And then it talks about 4 judicae, or lager men, not men who drink lager, but L-A-G-A, lawmen, lagermen. And in all those areas which had been occupied by the Danes, part of the Dane law, before the House of Wessex reconquered us, there were apparently usually 12 lawmen. And William, there were only 4 left in 1086. Maybe the other 8 had fought for the independence of the North in 1069, to whom the king granted privileges by writ. And of the above-mentioned mansions, that's the 1,418, there are now in the king's possession 391, inhabited, great and small, and 400 uninhabited, which yield customary services, but only a penny rent, and others less. And 540 mansions, so uninhabitable they pay nothing at all, and the Frenchmen hold 145 houses. What we get from this picture of York is a picture of houses uninhabited, people not living there. And if you count up the number of houses, it would appear that the population of York had been at least halved. But again, it is difficult to interpret what mansion means, how many people lived in a mansion, for instance. whether these were big houses with lots of rooms, etc. But what's interesting, when you look at the coat of arms of York itself, and this is the civic arms, you have the 5 lions of York in the middle. And there is a legend that these 5 lions represent 5 lagermen or aldermen or citizens or burghers of York, call them what you will, who defended York in 1069 against that William of Normandy. And that is a nice story. But there's also a link with another Norman, Ralph Pagnell, or Paynell, whose family came from Calvados, and his coat of arms was Gould's 5 lions passant gardant, which is exactly the same as the arms of the city of York. And this Ralph Pagnell fought at Hastings along with his elder brother William and held 100 manors in 1086 in Yorkshire, 15 in Yorkshire. His main seat was at Drax, and as you can see, quite a few manors down here. There's York. He also, in 1089, inflamed by the fire of divine love, desiring to treasure up in heaven what I can after this life receive 100-fold, set up, gave the community of secular canons at Holy Trinity Priory land. And he gave them, which tells us how rich he was, the churches of St Helens in Fishergate Street and All Saints North Street in York, lands in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, a fishery at Drax, and the churches of Leeds and Adder. So I leave it up to you whether the 5 lions of York are the 5 lagermen who defended York against William, or tried to, or whether it's the coat of arms of this Ralph Pagnell. What of the very last Saxon Earl Waltheof, son of Seward? Seward, Earl of Northumbria, is actually, so we are told, buried in St Olaf's Church. And he died and was buried there in 1055. His son Waltheof had rebelled against William of Normandy, but William forgave him, realising that all Waltheof wanted was his father's inheritance as Earl of Northumbria. So he married him to his niece Judith. Wasn't a happy marriage, and Waltheof was involved in another rebellion in 1075 and ended up being executed. But what's interesting is when you look at St Olaf's, which is now on the edge of the site of the Benedictine Abbey of St Mary's, and here's an image of the still standing ruins of St Mary's in York. Apparently the lands of St Mary's were once called Earlsborough, where the lords, the great lords, like Seward, father of Waltheof, would have their mansion houses when they visited York. It is therefore perhaps no surprise that in 1088 William the Conqueror and Count Alan of Richmond establish the Benedictine Abbey of St Mary's precisely on the lands where Anglo-Saxon thanes would have their town houses. Quite a symbol of conquest. So what of William? Well, he died in 1087 in France. And apparently, we have it on good authority from a contemporary chronicler, he was sorry about the harrying of the north. And so we should be. May God forgive me, he said. I have taken what was not mine to take. I have persecuted the English beyond all reason. Whether gentle or simple, I have cruelly oppressed them.